received from Alison Harris and Gordon MacDonald, and John Mason is attending as Gordon MacDonald's substitute. The first item on the agenda is about a decision on taking business in private. Item 1 is a decision by the committee to take items 4 and 7 in private. Are we agreed on that? Thank you. We now turn to item 2 on the agenda, and this is the COVID inquiry by the committee into the impact of COVID on Scotland's businesses, workers and the economy. We have witnesses joining us remotely today, and these are, first of all, Robin McAlpine, who's the Director at Commonweal, Jack Evans, who's the Scotland Policy and Partnerships Manager for Work for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and Peter Kelly, who's the Director of the Poverty Alliance. So I'll just welcome those 3 witnesses this morning. And just to say that broadcasting will operate the comms, but please allow broadcasting colleagues just a few seconds to turn your microphone on before you start to answer. I'll begin with the first question, and perhaps I could ask panel members what the most pressing current issues facing Scotland's economy are as a result of the COVID measures that have been put in place this year. I don't know who would like to go first in responding to that question. To indicate you'd like to come in, simply raise your hand, as Robin McAlpine, whom I'll bring in at this moment, has done, or type an R in the chat box, please. So, first of all, Robin McAlpine.
One of the things which I don't think has been discussed enough is not just the question of saving jobs. So everyone has been focusing on the issue of jobs, which is obviously important, particularly for under 35s, where the job market is really looking appalling and things are very difficult. But one of the things I also want to emphasise here is that we've got to think about the balance of the economy. And the balance of the economy that we're going to have after this is really important. And what I think I really want to emphasise is that if we allow the attrition, the problems that businesses are having during the course of COVID, to take down businesses who do not have reserves, but allow businesses that do have reserves to continue to work, the risk is that what we lose is Scotland's indigenous industry base, our domestic industry base. So what happens if we don't get this right is that the small local cafe can't continue to trade for another 9 months during COVID restrictions, and the local cafe or the independent or the community cafe closes. But what we end up with is that multinational chains which have reserves or which own their assets or own their properties are able to continue to operate, and when things open back up again, they're in a position to expand into the parts of the economy where we've seen domestic business loss. And Scotland is already arguably the most foreign-owned economy in the developed world. It's certainly one of the most foreign-owned economies in the developed world. We cannot afford to have more of our indigenous industry base lost through this. So it's not just a question. One of the things which I think has been put in this debate is the idea that this is only about jobs, any jobs, all jobs. It is, of course, about jobs, and this is particularly true for younger people, but we've also got to think about the balance of what economy is left after this, and we've got to remember that any country relies on its own indigenous domestic industry base as a foundation for its economy. We can't become a wholly foreign-owned monopolistic economy, and this is why we've got to be scalpel-like focused on the need not just to intervene in jobs, but to intervene on business protection and business survival. And I'd say there's an enormous amount more that could be said about what needs to be done, but I just want to raise that one key factor, which I think is important.
All right, thank you. Jack Evans.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. The ONS labour force survey results that came out today showed that there are 74,000 less people in work than there was at this time last year. And we know that the impacts of this recession are going to be falling even more heavily on people already at high risk of poverty than in other recessions, because the economic impacts are centred on leisure, hospitality, and other parts of non-essential retail, which already had very high rates of in-work poverty. I think it's also important to point out that the furlough scheme we now have in place is good support for people, but there are people who are slipping through the cracks, and particularly those on insecure contracts, zero contracts, temporary contracts, and those are most likely to have lost their jobs before being furloughed. Also, job creation has not recovered to its pre-recession levels, although through summer, and it's likely to be hit again. And it's very hard for people to find new jobs. There are some reasons to be optimistic, where demand is growing in social care, distribution and warehousing, and some new green retrofitting jobs. What the government must do is all it can to grow the jobs in the sectors and help people get the skills to move into them.
And Peter Kelly.
Thanks. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to attend the session today. I think to pick up on the points that Jack and Robin have made, I think some of the most pressing issues that we face really are a continuation of problems that our economy went into COVID with. So from our perspective, from the engagement that we've had with our members, particularly in the third sector, and for people who are living on low incomes, it's the experience of economic injustice and inequality that was all too common for people going into this crisis that's been magnified by the COVID crisis and by our necessary response to the COVID crisis. So whilst Robin's absolutely right, it's not just about jobs. It is certainly partly about exclusion from the labour market, and that impact on young people in particular, which we're starting, despite the statistics that came out today, the unemployment statistics that came out today, we are still seeing that increase in youth unemployment that had been expected. And I think it's a differential impact. So it's the kind of jobs that will be lost, it's the kind of jobs that we have. So the impact on women in particular, as a result of some of the measures that have been taken, the impact on people from Black and ethnic minority communities. I think we need to be particularly conscious in our economic recovery plans of those impacts. I think it's not just about unemployment, as Robin has said. It's about the kind of jobs that we have, and it's about the experience of the labour market that many people have. So again, we're in the midst of Living Wage Week, which I have to mention. We know that 350,000 people in Scotland are still paid less than the real living wage. It's about instability and uncertainty in terms of people's contracts and their position in the labour market. And again, we can see a very differential impact in terms of women, in terms of disabled workers, in terms of young people. So it's not just about unemployment, as Robin says, it's about the kind of jobs and what kind of jobs we might have and the quality of those jobs coming out of this crisis.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got quite a lot of people want to come in with questions, and I'm just wondering if you could perhaps think about this, perhaps bring it into some of your further answers, is what specifically can be done to address the issues that the three of you have identified specifically. So I'll come now to questions from the Deputy Convener, Willie Coffey, who joins us remotely.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to Robin and to Jack and to Peter. It's just to try to pick up and continue that theme that you opened with there, Convener. The members will be aware of the Jaeger report that came out in June, and it talked about things like the four capitals: natural capital, social networks, and so on. I was interested in Robin's opening remarks there about the smaller Indigenous businesses with no resources. How do you think, Robin, we can take that forward to try to make sure we don't leave out these kinds of businesses? I'm sure members on the committee are getting a number of representations from small businesses that don't seem to fall within the various categories for assistance and so on. But what would your suggestions be, and what would the other panellists' suggestions be to enable us to take all this forward to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen and we don't lose these valuable small businesses?
Okay, what I think we've got to get our heads round is this is not a normal crisis. This is an exceptional crisis. This is the collapse of demand in the market at the same time as we're getting all sorts of supply chain issues, blah, blah, blah. This is not normal. And my criticism of the Economic Recovery Group's report was that it was very normal. It was extreme orthodoxy. It's exactly what Scottish Enterprise would have done last year. So it's not that it was terrible, it's that it wasn't matching the problem. So let me give you a couple of examples of the sorts of things that I think we're thinking of at this stage. So let's take the Indigenous industries. From the very beginning of this, I've been arguing that it is not the fundamental nature of these businesses that's the problem. These cafes, a lot of these manufacturing places, these service providing companies would be entirely viable as soon as the pandemic is over. What is causing the deep distress to them is that while their income has collapsed, their rents and debts are still being serviced. So they're losing income, but they're not being protected from their outgoings. Now, I think there should have been a rent freeze and a debt moratorium for the period of this. Asking businesses to operate when they're paying their outgoings as if their ingoings are still normal is the problem. But those are reserved to Westminster. So I think we need to try and do something radical. One of the things that I'd like to suggest that might be looked at would be a national asset cooperative. So businesses which are losing, Indigenous businesses which are losing their assets, this is the key. Businesses which can hold their assets will be viable when it's time to reopen. If you lose your chairs, you can't reopen. So it's protecting the assets. So one of the things I think might be worth looking at is to see if you could create a national fund which would take distressed assets, which would be, I mean, there's no market for empty cafe space, for empty retail space, and purchase those in a cooperative. Take the assets in a cooperative, hold them. They would need to be subsidised with some public money, the cost of those, but maybe only for the, 9 months that we've still to go with this, hopefully. And then at the end of that, the businesses could either buy their assets back or lease them back from the National Cooperative. And if this was publicly backed and backed with the Scottish National Investment Bank, what it would mean is that no viable business need go out of business. Whatever happens at the end of this, their assets will still be in place. I suspect that you're probably understating the amount to which you're all being contacted by local businesses saying, there's nothing wrong with my business as soon as I can get customers back in, but I'm going down the tubes because they're still taking my monthly rent payments on a business that I can't operate. This is one of the key problems. The other thing which I think we've got to look at in response to all of this, so I mean, that's quite a big idea, and I think it would be really helpful. It would also have an impact of actually bringing down commercial rents, which would be very helpful for a lot of Indigenous businesses in Scotland. Maybe not so much for the pension funds, but right now my heart lies with the businesses, not the pension funds. Everybody's not coming out of this completely unscathed, and I think the pension funds will survive. So I think it's more important that we focus on the businesses. The other thing that I think we've got to do, which again I just didn't think the Recovery Group looked at, is frankly getting our hands a bit dirty. We can't save everything, but we can't save it through macro approaches. So the standard Scottish economic development approach is whatever happens down there, you stand 100 yards back and you tweak, turn levers and knobs and let things flow into and out of the economy. But that's not getting your hands dirty. You're going to have to say at this point, right, look, it's not just about hoping the market makes new jobs. We've got to make new jobs. We've got to take action in this. The big screaming obvious one that we've been pushing a lot is that we're going to have to re-insulate every house in Scotland. We're going to have to fit new heating systems to decarbonise. We're going to have to do an enormous amount of work to move to this circular economy that we're going to have to do if we're going to meet targets. Now, we did a lot of work in this. We published an entire costed Green New Deal. It's going to take 25 years to do this. And the biggest barrier to this is the workforce. We are massively lacking the workforce that we need to do this. And these are all skilled jobs. So what we did in our work, we produced an economic recovery document called Resilient Scotland. And what we said was, take a value judgment about the kind of jobs you want to prioritise. Make, build, grow, do, serve productive things because they pay well. They're high productivity, they're high value, they pay well. take a value judgment about the kind of jobs that you want to support to recover, manufacturing, high quality service jobs, and intervene. So the standard practice is don't make a value judgment, stand back, let the market correct. But this is not a normal market. We have to make some value judgments. And I think we should just simply, straightforwardly learn the lessons of the past. This is FDR time. This is Great Depression time. This is two massive economic crises back to back. We weren't recovered from the last one when we hit the next one. This is a big deal. We've got to be thinking FDR-ish, and the obvious FDR thing is a Green New Deal to create an enormous number of jobs. This will pay for itself if we get this right. It's the right kind of jobs. So that's two examples. One where you're saying we're going to intervene because we're making a value judgment about businesses we want to save, and another one where we're saying we're making a value judgment about the kinds of jobs that we want and the kind of supply chains in Scotland which will fuel those jobs. So those jobs aren't just public jobs. These create big supply chains for the Scottish private sector. These are the kind of scales of interventions that we need to look at.
Thank you very much for that, Robin. Really helpful. Jack and Peter, a contribution from both of you, please.
Yeah. So I think I'd just like to endorse what Robin has just said. That question around storing up debts, I think that's something that's come to us not through contacts with business, but through contacts with advice providers and individuals. So real concern about the accumulation of debt at the moment, and that will come to there will come a moment when that has to be repaid. And so we need to be thinking about the economic impact of that on individuals in the future, in the next 6 months or so. But I think Robin's point about what kind of intervention do we want to make in the economy, and what kind of jobs do we want to create, what kind of economy do we want to move to, I think it's very clear that we need to have the kind of green recovery that Robin's talked about. In our response to the Economic Recovery Group, we'd emphasised that too. We'd endorsed the proposals in the Climate Emergency Response Group about investing in retrofitting and so on. So I think that kind of approach, Robin makes the case very well about the impact that has on Indigenous businesses, on high value, high skill jobs, so-called high skill jobs, down the supply chain. So that's really important. The other area where I think we've started to see some activity, where we really need to see continued investment and more investment, is around social care. That would then, investing in that sector, really expanding and improving the conditions, which again, I think we need to recognise where there has been progress. So Scottish Government has made really important efforts with the employers in that sector to ensure that the living wage is paid. We can build on that. I think this is a sector where there is going to be expansion. I think Jack mentioned that earlier. There's going to be expansion in the future. We need to ensure that expansion is quality and is based on fair work principles. So in terms of where we create jobs, think about the kinds of investment around social care and about the kinds of jobs that we want to create there. Again, it has that added benefit of impacting predominantly female workforce, and improving conditions for women will help tackle in-work poverty, will help tackle poverty overall.
Thanks, Peter. Jack?
I would like to probably talk about a specific part of the response from Scottish Government to the report on 2.1.1 on supporting recovery through procurement. So JRF welcomes Scottish Government highlighting that procurement spending across the public sector presents a vital opportunity to maximise the impact of investment to boost economic recovery and to deliver sustainable, inclusive growth. I think there's probably a specific area I'd be interested in. The last 5 years I've worked at Poverty Alliance on the real living wage and worked with procurement managers to insert non-statutory insertion of the living wage. This has been very successful and has seen Scotland increase its share of jobs paid by at living wage. But as we know, we can't legally require any public contract to pay the living wage because of the European Commission's ruling on the Posted Workers Directive. I think there's an opportunity after Brexit, or with Brexit in mind, to reassess Scotland's ability to procure at living wage and ensure that every job is paid at the real living wage. And I think that's could definitely make an impact on some of the sectors that we mentioned around social care, but also in the construction industry.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for that.
We're perhaps, I think we have quite a few members want to come in with questions. I know that Richard Lyle wanted a very brief supplementary there. So I'll let Richard Lyle in for a brief supplementary and then we'll move to Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Robin, many sections are not being helped. We know that. Do you agree with me that we have to help all the sections of our community to survive this pandemic, whatever the cost? A cost which will be paid back eventually, like FDR time. So it's time to be bold. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. But the only thing I would add to that is that we have tried to be extremely realistic. So we spent 8 months working an economic recovery plan. And what we tried to do is be very realistic. If we had full fiscal powers in Scotland, full powers, it would be time to be bold. Throw money at this. That's going to be the response. It will repay itself. It really will, compared to the cost of dealing with the poverty. Unfortunately, we don't have limitless powers in the Scottish Parliament. So setting that aside, this is not constitutional debate. It is where we are for the next few years when we're going to be dealing with this. So setting aside the constitutional debate, what we've got to look at is exactly where we can create substantial investment into the Scottish economy without assuming that we can do a lot of government borrowing, because there's a limit to how much governments can borrow. And we've tried to explain 5 areas in which Scotland can really hammer investment into the economy without public subsidy. So we've tried to show, there isn't time to talk about them all just here. I'm happy to send any material through to the committee. But for example, you can build public rental housing and create supply chains through the domestic construction industry without subsidy. You do not need subsidy to build public rental housing if you do it properly via the Scottish National Investment Bank. The Scottish National Investment Bank is another example. We completely concur with the Economic Recovery Group that you should immediately seek dispensation from Treasury to allow the Scottish National Investment Bank to capitalise from sources other than the Scottish Government, which would mean it could become an almost unlimited lender if there is capacity in the economy. But energy is another key one. We could do an enormous amount more to capture the economic benefits of energy for Scotland and the jobs that are potentially to be generated from that. And I just want to double support what Jack was saying about public procurement. We spend our public procurement in Scotland in a manner which is almost designed to cut out Scottish business. And I've been campaigning for this for 10 years. It's inexplicable why we have not been making it easier for Indigenous Scottish businesses get contracts. This is an enormous amount of money, and particularly food processing industries in Scotland and food retail would benefit greatly if they had much more access to sell to the Scottish public sector. So what we've been trying to do all the way through this is say, this is a big investment moment. You're going to have to be bold, but then you've got to work with the limitations of where you are. There's only so much that it's possible to do with the powers of the Scottish Parliament. So you've really, really got to focus on the area where you can drive investment into big investment into the economy without requiring public subsidy. And so these are the sorts of areas that we think we can do it. But let me say just one thing that I think I maybe should have said at the opening. There was a massive economic restructuring which was coming already. So everyone's been talking about the arrival of artificial intelligence, of new manufacturing processes, of the impact of the internet, the increased remote working was already on the increase, the amount of online shopping as opposed to high street shopping, etc., etc. All these trends were coming, and everyone has been talking about them for a while. That it's not, people have to understand this. This crisis is not a blip which is going to then revert back to where we were. This is accelerating the economic changes and restructuring which was already coming. And this is the really important thing, is that it's only bounced us forward, it's accelerated what was happening. And my best judgment is that this is going to have as much of a disruptive impact as deindustrialization of the 1980s. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about here, a permanent restructuring of the economy. We have got to take this very seriously. I was sitting with my jaw hanging at the early stages of this crisis when people were talking about V-shaped recovery, which was just, it was fantastical. We've got to start taking seriously how bad the knock-on impacts of this could be. And the knock-on impacts are worrying. We haven't even talked about the risk of middle-class homeowners losing homes because they're over-mortgaged and can't lose partial income. All sorts of problems are still coming. Be bold or you'll regret it.
Right, thank you. We'll move on to questions from Rhoda Grant now.
Thank you, Convener. Could I just ask a quick supplementary to Robin McAlpin about, he talked about SNP and he talked about pension funds as being able to, SNP to invest and buy over businesses, and that might have an impact on pension funds. But are we maybe missing a trick here? Should we be using pension funds? Let's be honest, they won't be doing great just now, but should pension funds be investing in this kind of thing, either on their own or through SNP?
The difficulty is coordinating this. The big advantage, the big strength of SNP, the thing that SNP was invented for was strategic. So it's not just market, it's strategic. It's the ability to pursue public good investment. Now, just to be clear where the situation is at the moment. At the moment, the Scottish National Investment Bank is on books. It behaves as if it's a government department. So all of its borrowing is on the government books. Now, that's not the only way you can do investment banks. If the German investment bank's liabilities were on books, Germany would be the most indebted country in Europe. It's got, of course, the National Investment Bank in Germany is 40 years old, 60 years old. It's got massive, massive liabilities because it's lent enormous amounts of money. These are all viable. It's an operating bank. It's just not in public books. Likewise, in Britain, RBS is dispensation to be not counted as a government department, even though it's majority government owned. Now, if you were to give the same dispensation to the Scottish National Investment Bank, it could capitalise from pension funds. So you're right, pension funds are desperately looking for good places to put money. The Scottish National Investment Bank would be a very good bet. Pension funds could put their money in, and the Scottish National Investment Bank could direct it towards mission-orientated public good investments in Scotland. Where the difficulty comes at the moment is that in this sequential chain of problems, that when small businesses go down, the commercial properties are almost never owned by the small business. They're usually rented, and a lot of times it is pension funds who've invested in the commercial property which they are renting. And so the sequential domino topple goes, if too many of these businesses collapse, the value of commercial property will come down and the pension funds will take the hit anyway. So it's short-sighted to keep the rents high just now, because all that's going to do is reduce the value of commercial property in the future, which is when they'll take their hit. So what I'm really saying is that it would be very helpful if owners, property owners, investors, and who are in property funds, Scottish National Investment Bank, the Scottish Government, if you're all talking together to produce a strategy which was to keep as much value in the pension funds and the investors as possible, while ensuring that you're protecting to the maximum degree the domestic businesses. Now, the model that I was talking about would have involved distressed assets being bought directly by somebody from the owner of the asset of the premises, and then being held for later. If there's other ways to do it, great. But time is running out. We've not really been doing this for the last 6 months. We've just been hoping it's going to be okay. So these are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about. There's no shortage of investment in the world just now. There's hot money all over the global economy that's looking for somewhere safe, sensible, and reliable to go. And it's this really which could be used enormously to fund, in particular, house building. House building, public rental house building, is as safe as houses. You can you can find as much investment into house building as you need, and you can use that to generate high quality jobs and supply chains. So there's a whole host of ways in which you can do this. The problem isn't investment, the problem is directing it in a strategic manner during a crisis, and that's what the Scottish National Investment Bank should be doing.
Okay, and thank you for that. I think Orkney Island Council is doing some of that work, buying over businesses and leasing the premises back to help people over the hump. So I think that is going on in places. Can I just move on with another question, please? The Cabinet Secretary for the Economy has said the time for a wellbeing economy has well and truly arrived. And I wonder if the panellists think whether the lead of the Scottish Government's response to the advisory group on economic recovery actually recognises that and steps in that direction.
Peter Kelly.
So I think we've seen in terms of the response from Scottish Government, I think there's been a fairly long-standing recognition and movement towards an acceptance that we need to move towards a wellbeing economy. I think the efforts to build on the National Performance Framework, looking at using the National Performance Framework as the basis in which to build our model of a wellbeing economy is welcome. I think one of the issues with this is that the response at the national level, the discussion at the national level around the wellbeing economy often doesn't reach where it needs to reach. So there are good examples, things like the support for fair work and for the living wage. That's a building block of the wellbeing economy. Where I think we maybe see other elements where there are good signs for progress would be around the approach to community wealth building. So that, I think, again, brings together some of what we've already been talking about using local spend, about using procurement processes to build more inclusive local economies with decent work and fair work at their heart. So those things are really important. I think the rhetorical commitment to well-being is undoubtedly there in the Scottish Government. I think they believe it. I think we need to see more of the kind of positive actions that can be taken to ensure that a well-being economy actually delivers for people who need it, not just for businesses, but for the people who are on the receiving end, if you like, and need it.
Robin?
Just very quickly to say that I think here, as we talk to wellbeing economists, they're not persuaded. But let me just put it like this. Doing what you were doing before with different adjectives isn't a wellbeing economy. We're still inflating. We're taking active steps to inflate house prices. We're doing it right now. We're doing first-time buyer schemes, which the purpose of which is to continue to inflate house prices. A wellbeing economy does not have constantly increasing house prices. We are still subsidising low-pay employment. We're still, British Enterprise is still trying to attract the Amazons of this world. They're low-pay employers. That's not well-being. We're still obsessing about GDP. That's not well-being. We're still not taking structural steps to change the way that we're doing the economy. So let's be honest, this is a big generational shift. GDP has been God for so long that breaking away from it takes time. It just psychologically it takes people time. And let's just say that at least we're one stage of the way there, which is the rhetorical desire to do this is in place. But like an awful lot at the moment, it doesn't count if poverty is getting worse, and it doesn't count if renewable energy, if carbon emissions are stalling or getting worse, and all the rest of these things. So let's just say, like climate emergency, let's be generous and say that the press release is a step on the way to actually doing this differently. But I would really put the question back and say, right, well, show me something that's different. Show me something that's being done differently now than it was this time last year. There's not much. Procurement still doesn't have well-being clauses attached to it, and they can be. There's lots of well-being clauses you can attach to public procurement. Great, we're getting there. We're not there.
Jack, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
No, thank you though. It's an area that the JEC are supportive of. Sorry, is that my microphone back on? Sorry. It's an area the JRF are supportive of, and have also been looking at inclusive growth, but I've not yet in my position been able to get a proper opinion on that. Thanks.
Peter, were you wanting to come back in?
I think it's really just to. It's really just to. Sorry, phone call. It's really just to reinforce some of what Robin has said. You know, he talked about accelerating the kind of changes that are taking place, and what we need to accelerate and what we need to ensure that we're doing is not accelerating the existing inequalities. And there is far more that we need to do. We talked earlier about needing to take bolder action. That's undoubtedly the case. There's just no question about that. And I think, again, it is about saying, where do we do the investment that helps to practically build a well-being economy? What are the kinds of investments that we need to make? And we've already discussed some of them around retrofitting and so on. That's the kind of practical changes. But those changes need massively scaled up. It's very simple, and that's where investment needs to be targeted if we're to take more decisive steps towards the well-being economy.
All right, thank you. We'll move on now to questions from Andy Whiteman.
Thank you very much, Convener. Welcome, panel. I think in the same quote that Rhoda Grant was citing from the Cabinet Secretary on the 26th of May, she talked about the need for a revolution in economic thinking that stimulates and values cooperative sharing of risk and reward, which I think is a bold statement. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the actors that are involved here, Robin's already touched on the limitations of the powers of Scottish ministers and the Scottish Parliament. We have the UK government as another key actor, but one actor that's not really been much talked about in the economic debate is local government. And I'm just wondering, because historically local government had quite a more significant role in economic development than it does now. Robin was talking about the need to have local supply chains and supporting local economies. Is there something we need to do to bolster the powers of local government in terms of ensuring that we get through this pandemic with businesses and people as well as it can be? Robin.
Yeah, I mean, you know how I feel about this, Andy. Scotland's damn near the most centralised democracy in the developed world. We really are. We're the only major economy that's got a single-tier local authority system. We don't actually have a local authority system. We've got a semi-regional authority system. And it's trapped between two pincers, one of which is centralisation at the top, and it's not just the Scottish Government, it's its agencies, it's the central, it's the kind of Scottish enterprise, one model fits all of the country kind of approach. They've been trapped with declining incomes and increasing demand in local authority services. So local authorities have very little financial leeway to deal with things like this. And we've got the kind of general centralisation of the assumption of what Scotland is. So we've been doing work in the south of Scotland, and Dumfries and Galloway just gets forgotten. The Scottish borders are becoming a commuter zone for Edinburgh. The Highlands and Islands are partially protected by Highlands and Islands Enterprise, but even there, if you go into the Highlands now and talk to people, they're complaining about centralisation around Inverness. One of the great things is that we've now got an awareness of this idea of local wealth building. Local wealth building is so crucial. You have no idea how much you can get out of local wealth building, which is just retaining more of the wealth in a circulating, growing fashion in local areas. But it's really difficult to do that if you've got no local place of thinking. There's no localism to build the local wealth building around. And the two things that I would do straightforwardly, without a shadow of a doubt, is Scotland has got to fix its disgraceful local government. We're so far off the scale, so far off the scale of a normal European country in terms of our local smallest unit. A town cannot take economic action to save itself in Scotland because there is no democratic body at the level of even a large town. Nowhere else in Europe of our scale would say a town like Kirkcaldy have no autonomous economic development capacity. So that's one of the key things, is we've got to create a decentralised local government. The second thing is, if I was being completely honest with, I would take an enormous amount of the economic development power, which is centralised in national agencies, and I would devolve it down to the local authorities. I would give them much more power, much more responsibility, and quite a bit of that budget. We've got to get away from this paternal idea that people at the centre can fix everything for everybody everywhere. We've got to take our hands off the wheel sometimes and give a bit of power back to local communities, local areas, regions. Let them pursue strategies with their knowledge of the place where they're based. The problem is that with this crisis, we haven't emphasised this so much with this crisis because you can't fix the structures fast enough to deal with it. You couldn't get the money to the local authorities fast enough to enable them to gear up their economic development response fast enough to deal with this. So let me put that down as let's learn the lesson. Let's never go into a crisis like this again in the most centralised democracy in Western Europe. Let's make sure that in future we've got decentralised government, not only for the economic recovery, but I'll be honest with you, how many of you are in a place where local communities have stepped forward and created support and action groups which got entire communities through this COVID crisis? I live in a town and I'm in awe of what has been done by a group of about 40 mostly women who got together and created the support group which has kept this town going all the way through COVID, and they had to hack that together in the first 3 or 4 days of the crisis because we don't have a town council that could have taken that job over. Let's never get into that situation again. The next time that we face any kind of crisis like this, let's have a responsive local democracy, which means that places can take their own responses to these quickly and fast in an accountable manner.
Right. I think Peter Kelly would like to come in and could ask witnesses to make their answers as succinct and to the point as they can, because we're rapidly running out of time here. Thank you. Peter Kelly, and then back to Andy Whiteman.
Thanks, Convener. I'll be brief. Again, just to say, I think Robin's point is one that I would build on, that we've seen absolutely central to the response to COVID being not only local government, but the community sector in general, working alongside local government, has been the way in which we've been able to coordinate and respond to the crisis. As Robin has said, not enough power to scale up and carry out the necessary economic development activity in the midst of the crisis. But what that does say is that we need to devolve power to local government. And I think we've known this for a long time. We were due in 2010 to go through the next stage of the local governance review. Who knows where that would have taken us to, but that has stalled now, obviously. I think we need to put some real fire and energy back into discussions about how we genuinely devolve power to local communities, not just to local government, but to local communities. So, yeah, I think that has stymied our response and will do into the future if we don't get that right.
Okay, thank you very much. I just got one other question, which comes from the response of the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, where they talk about the need not only to mitigate inequality, but to reduce it. Is it your view, and Peter, perhaps I can start with you, that there's sufficient thinking and sufficient content in Scottish Government's recovery plans to actually reduce the inequalities that, as you said in an earlier remark, have been exacerbated by the COVID crisis?
I think we're certainly not doing enough. I think the Economic Recovery Group said very little about social security. Social security can't solve inequality on its own, but it can certainly play a significant role. The report said practically nothing about the role of social security in providing decent incomes and reducing inequalities. I think around the gendered impact of COVID, again, I think it was really quite light, and therefore the government's response to that report really didn't bring in that aspect of inequality and inequalities sufficiently clearly. So I think there is far more needs to be done. At the moment, again, I go back to what Robin was saying about accelerating changes. What we want to ensure doesn't happen here is that we accelerate the inequalities. At the moment, that's what will happen. We know that the worst hit sectors, that hit has been delayed somewhat because of the extension of furlough, but the worst hit sectors are those that are already employing more people on precarious kinds of contracts and low-paid employment. That will further embed these existing inequalities. And I think in terms of our recovery plans, if we don't invest in sectors like social care, if we don't ensure that the training programs that come out, so the jobs guarantee and so on, if we don't ensure that those are properly gendered as well, we will again reinforce and make more difficult efforts to address both income inequality and other inequalities.
Okay, thank you very much. Convener.
Thank you. And now we come to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. We've had a fair bit of discussion, particularly on perhaps the most worrying aspect of the pandemic, which is obviously the impact on jobs. There was a recent JRF report on Scotland showing that a drop in the hours worked and the number of individuals in receipt of universal credit in Scotland, both in and out of work, had nearly doubled compared to January. Now, these are worrying statistics. Taking into account the fact that an awful lot of the legislation and so on around about employment is actually still reserved to Westminster, do you think that the current labour market interventions by both the Scottish Government and the UK Government are sufficient to stem some of these job losses? Robin?
No, I mean, really no. I still think there's denial about where we are. I still have this real concern that people think that there isn't a knock-on chain here, and this is the problem. This is a few months in. You know, this is like trying to discuss the Great Depression in 1930, January 1930. A lot of the knock-on effects that are likely to come from this haven't even been feeding through the system yet. I just keep repeating, there's things that Scotland can do, there's things Scotland can't do. We can't really do anything about social security. It's just not, we can tinker around the edges, but there's not much we can do. What we can do is do our very best to try and not need it. But I'd be interested to see where more analysis about where these breakdowns are. But I think you'll find an enormous amount of it's among the young, an enormous amount of it is among the low and semi-skilled. A lot of this will be women, particularly I think older women who are working in service sectors. You know, you may not understand the importance of places like nail bars and beauty salons, but these are important employment for working class women, particularly in the run up to Christmas, and a lot of them will not be funding their Christmas with these things this year. There ain't no office parties to get your hair done for. And these are big problems that are still to filter through this system. We have got, this is what I'm saying about getting our hands dirty. We've got to look and say, right, we've got to create high-skilled jobs for younger people. We've got to do it, or we're going to regret it. They're going to be a generation that's unemployed for a long period. We've got to look at the housing problems that are faced by young people. And an enormous amount of their income goes in housing. We've got to look at the kinds of jobs that would have been done by the people that are getting displaced. We've got to be forensic about creating and stimulating opportunities to get as many of them into work as we possibly can. And where we don't, and this is where I cannot emphasise enough that we should take strategic long-term thinking here. We've got to link this crisis into the next one, which is the climate crisis. We've got to say to ourselves, right, now is the time to set a 25-year plan, because one of the things that we can do quickly is get people trained. If we can't create the employment overnight, we can train them overnight for employment that we know is coming. So if we need, and we've costed this, Scotland's going to need an extra 3,000 joiners, an extra 4,000 electricians, just to do the things that we need to do to get through climate change. We can start this training process just now. There's thousands upon thousands of jobs. We're going to need them. But we've got to have a plan that goes beyond the next 6 months Otherwise, we're going to go back to that thing of training, any training, that's good for the statistics. No, we've got to train strategically. We've got to think strategically in all of this. And I'm really nervous. And just one word for saying that if you talk to citizens advice bureaus, one of the things that you'll find this time round is that it ain't just the usual suspects that are getting hit. So the poor are getting hit. Of course they are. Women are getting hit. They always do. You know these people are going to suffer every time that we get economic crises. But there's a real concern that a lot of middle-class households can't lose one or even half an income because they're very highly over-mortgaged, and it can set off strings of problems, repossessions, which plunge people who didn't expect. So if all of you think that you can ride out the working class anger, you might not be able to ride out working class and middle class anger. So, like I say, I think you really want to be taking bold interventions now to hold together the kind of social cohesion and political cohesion, despite the disagreements. There's a surprisingly strong political cohesion in Scotland. We've got to take action now. Poverty eats into so much of what we need to tackle the next thing that's coming. So let's do everything we can now to not need to worry about that later.
This committee is taking clear evidence that youth unemployment has risen fairly dramatically. Given that the Scottish Government basically is kind of restricted to helping out in areas such as training and apprenticeships and such like, is the government doing enough? Should it be doing it differently? Would anyone else like to come in on that? Peter?
So I think the jobs guarantee, the work that Sandy Begley's been doing, I think that's an excellent start. There are some things that we would like to have seen added into that, and to ensure that that the living wage was going to be the benchmark against which to measure the development of the Scottish Jobs Guarantee. But I think, again, going back to some of what Robin was saying, this needs to be about what kinds of jobs do we want to support, what kinds of training do we need to target on, and I think things that are linked to the changes that are going to take place in our economy, not just around the need to build more houses and the need to account for climate change and to invest in those kind of industries, but digital is obviously, an area where we need to scale up our investment, both in terms of the infrastructure, but in the training and how we can further develop what's already a reasonably decent sector in Scotland in terms of digital. So thinking about things like the training opportunities that will be created through the guarantee, but how those fit with the future developments and future needs of our economy are going to be really important. I think one of the messages we're also getting back from some of our members who are more involved in sort of frontline delivery around employability and working with young people is the complexity of the scene as well, and making sure that where possible we try and simplify the employability landscape to ensure that people are able to access the right support when they need it.
Does anyone else want to make a comment on that one? Jack?
Thank you. I would echo a lot of what Peter and Robin have just said there, but I think as well, a real focus needs to be on productivity and thinking about areas that government and employers can be doing. So I think there's kind of three key points within that, and that's about improving the skills to allow people that are in work to progress out of low-paid work, to improve our transport. Our JRF research shows that poor transport can disconnect people from local labour markets and impact on businesses as they don't have access to the correct pool of labour. And also there's a large problem about being too many low-paid, low-productivity jobs in areas that we know are getting hit right now, retail, leisure and hospitality. And it's easy to forget them in the conversation of productivity and recovery because they're just seen as those low-paid jobs. Whereas if we look at competitors in France and Germany or Denmark, are significantly more productive in those low-paid jobs. So there's work that we can done in those sectors to help with the recovery. And that's things that employers can also help with, including things like increasing manager standards and access to in-work training shall be supported.
Thank you. Just to bring up the wellbeing economy, which was touched on previously, the Scottish Government's obviously committed to developing a wellbeing economy monitoring framework based on the National Performance Framework, and that will assess obviously how Scotland performs across the multiple dimensions of well-being and whether gaps are reducing between groups. Are you satisfied that the well-being economy monitoring framework is achievable, and will it make a difference? Robin.
One of my favourite quotations about public policy is that you never fattened a pig by weighing it. Now, this is the problem. It's a standard practice of managerial government is if you don't know what to do, count something. It wouldn't work. I mean, year after year we miss poverty statistics, year after year we miss education statistics, and most glaringly of all, year after year we miss environmental statistics, targets and goals. The problem isn't measuring it. The problem is the structures that are causing difficulties. And unless we change the structures, we can keep counting it, but it won't fix things. So, this isn't quantum physics. Things don't change just because you look at them. You've got to change them. You've got to do something to change them. So it's not unhelpful to set these frameworks, but these frameworks tell you something, they say something about what it is that you think success looks like. Now, that's important. I'm not going to decry that. Well, becoming a woolly phrase that can mean whatever people want it to mean. So defining exactly what you think success and well-being looks like is an important part of it, but it's not the only part of it. And I'm just going to be absolutely clear about this. If you look at who the Scottish Government was talking over the summer, and I'm going to be delicate about this, it wasn't the well-being economists. This is one of the key things here. It was not that sector which was really the go-to when we started to look at this economic problem. And again, it can't be a tack on. Well-being is a description of an economy that's working in a certain way. It's not a thing you glue on an economy. It's an outcome you get from an economy. And I mean, today alone, you're looking at statistics which say over the last 10 years, well-being has declined, not got better. It's got worse. And we've got to face up to this. The next 10 years are looking like another 10 years of lost well-being if we don't do something differently. I'm going to say one more time, please, everybody, housing is at the heart of well-being. And just when you were asking about young people there, I was talking to a young postgraduate economist. She was interviewing me for something. And just in the conversation, at one point she said to me, why is it you older people keep saying intergenerational conflict is a shame? She says, as far as I'm concerned, it's nothing like pitchfork and burning torch enough. Now, you've got to look at a generation under 35 who have been entirely priced out of housing. The impact of housing on the lives of people under 35 is unbelievable. And that's because the policy in housing has all been made by people in their 40s who've already paid, already got their mortgages. They're seeing this as if constantly inflating house prices forever is a win-win for absolutely everybody. It isn't, and at some point they're going to push this so far, there's going to be this massive backlash. Housing is at the heart of well-being. If you've got a warm house you can afford, leaves you enough money to buy food, you've got a fighting chance of well-being. And we're talking to students, we've got a youth group, there's a Commonweal youth group, and what they talk about most of all is housing. Housing and work. They can't get work. And even if they get work, they can't get work that pays for a house in the place where the work is. And they're all renting, and they don't see how they get off the renting cycle. We're not doing well-being well. And bluntly, we're not even taking a proper aggressive approach to the bits of well-being that aren't working. We've got to build affordable rental, high-quality housing for young professionals because the private sector's not delivering it at prices that they can afford at the moment. So, no, we're not. I say it again, you never fatten the pig by weighing it, ever.
Does anyone else have a view on this?
Well, I think actually we're rather short on time, and we'll move on to questions from Maurice Golden now.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener. Robin earlier mentioned the circular economy, and of course, Scotland has some of the most ambitious circular economy and climate change targets in the world, only matched by a litany of failure in this space, from recycling targets, procurement, and green jobs. And I wonder if the panel have any thoughts on if the Scottish Government have the correct policies in place to deliver a green economy.
Again, the principles are fine. It's the delivery. So let's pick an example. I want to emphasise here all the way through this that when I'm talking about green economy, I'm talking about massive opportunities for the private sector here. This is not all state intervention. This is about using a national strategy to develop opportunities right across the economy. So let me give you an example of where I would be really putting effort in if it was down to me, if I was doing it. So I'll give you two really quick areas. First of all, Scotland has massive hydrogen potential. We are watching a number of good hydrogen projects in Scotland struggle themselves into life in the private sector. We should be throwing all of our efforts behind hydrogen. Scotland could become the world centre on clean hydrogen. It really is a massive area. And the technologies would be exportable, and it will be an enormous opportunity for Scotland. But I'll give you another one in the circular economy front. Scotland has the lowest level of forestry cover proportionately in Europe. We have the highest potential for forestry anywhere in Europe. Because I'm on Zoom, I just want to, or whatever, just going to do this that I do quite a bit. This here is solid plastics, my pen holder, printed in a 3D printer by my head of policy in his house. This is 100% cellulose. This is an entirely wood-based bioplastic. We've got this massive forestry potential. We have got the need to move to new materials which are circular, which biodegrade at the end of their lifetime. There is a world of research that needs to be done on bioplastics. Scotland has the science, Scotland has the land, Scotland has the capacity to build the trees, Scotland has a history of industrial light manufacture and heavy manufacture. Scotland could be really taking steps to invest in wood processing, and we don't process wood anything like enough. We don't plant trees or grow trees anything like enough. So that's just two examples in the realm of circular economy where we've got quite a big gap between what we want to achieve and how much actual investment and intervention we're currently doing. And again, these are such business opportunities. I really want to see the reindustrialisation of rural Scotland based around wood processing. It's such a massive opportunity, particularly when that's where our energy is as well, because of our Scotland's emphasis on renewables. So there's enormous opportunities if we take this seriously, but I don't think we are yet. We've got the targets, we now need the action.
Thank you, Robin. Peter Kelly?
Just to come in briefly, I think it's points that I've already made earlier. So in terms of marrying up different agendas, that's clearly what we need to do. So the jobs, the homes, the environmental policies, we need to bring those things more closely together in a really properly strategic and action-orientated way as well. So again, going back to the previous question around measurement frameworks, and measurement frameworks are important, but what's really important is the action that's taken. So again, just two areas where our policies are not living up to broad range of goals, not just in terms of our economic policies, but our poverty reduction ones as well. So if we looked again at retrofitting, so a bigger investment in Warmer Home Scotland and Heaps Abs, we talked about doubling the investment for that this year. That projection is probably out of date now, but that's what we've been looking at the beginning of the year. So that's one area where we need to significantly ramp up our investment that will have broad ranging impacts, both environmental, employment and well-being. And the other area would be transport. So transport probably isn't big on everyone's agenda at the moment, as many people work at home, but of course not everyone. But I think investment in transport that people, and particularly people living on low incomes, use is fundamentally important in transforming our economy towards that green economy that we all say that we want. So greater investment in green buses, and I think there are questions to be had about how we are actually investing in the Scottish businesses that exist that should actually make those green buses, but also about our infrastructure in terms of roads and where we're putting our spend there in terms of what would actually deliver a green economy.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. And I think Richard Lyle has a further question.
Yeah, you know, I have to say, driving around Scotland, I see a hell of a lot of, a massive amount of wind turbines. Scotland now produces more electricity from wind turbines than quite a number. We planted 26 million trees last year. I visited a sawmill in Aboyne, which was very productive. So, yes, Robin, I agree with 95% of what you're saying today, but there are 5%, there are things in Scotland that we are doing right, and with the greatest respect to Morris, wind turbines is a massive thing. The only problem is that, as Robin said earlier, we're not giving the contracts to Scottish companies, and that's the problem.
Is that the question?
Yeah. How can we give more contracts to Scottish companies?
Peter Kelly, Jack Evans, do you have any comment on this?
Well, listen, I don't know if I'm supposed to...
Jack Evans, Jack Evans wanted to come in.
Okay.
Yeah, just a brief point. After working with procurement experts for the last 5 years, who are very dedicated to their jobs, but also a lot is put on them, as in procurement is the solution to every single problem, and is the route out of poverty for everyone. I think that it must be understood that we need to redesign the frameworks around procurement to make sure that we can give value for money at the same time as creating sustainable jobs and a green economy. And again, one of those points would be around the statutory guidance on fair work and procurement, and that should be strengthened in the coming years, ensure that the jobs that are created and the things that are created are done in a way that enhances inclusive growth and doesn't make it even harder.
And Peter Kelly.
I don't know if I've too much to add to what Jack and Robin have already said, but I think we clearly need to make more investments in Scottish companies to deliver the things that we need for the green economy. I think I agree that there are lots of wind turbines about. It looks as though a lot's happening, but where is that investment leading in terms of jobs in Scotland? I think the experience of the Bifab yard is not one that would say that we're going in the right direction all the time on this issue.
Thank you. And perhaps a very brief right to reply, as it were, to Robin McAlpine. I think, as Richard Lyles pointed out, the size of forests in Scotland has increased quite a bit over the past decade or so, but we'll give you a brief right to reply, as it were.
Yes, it's increased to be the lowest rate in Europe. Again, 18% of Scotland's land's forestry, 75% of Finland's forestry. And yes, we're processing it, but we're processing it in very basic ways, and we're not capturing the high-end stuff, the cross-laminated timber, the structural products. Only 20% of Scotland's construction materials are made in Scotland. Scotland imports from the Czech Republic all of its cellulose, which is wood-based insulation. So all of our organic insulation is flown in, despite the fact that we've got this forestry potential. But let me give you another example, because I'm obsessive about this. It really is the biggest mistake the Scottish economy has made is allow itself to become so foreign-owned and not to negotiate more of the benefit of the Scottish economy. So let me just tell you this. Right now, a major wind farm in Scotland is switching its turbines from one manufacturer to another. Why is this happening? Because the French government demanded that in turn for it getting planning rights to deploy renewable energy in France, that company was obliged to buy a certain amount of the turbines, not the blades, but the turbines, from a French company. So right now in Scotland, we are seeing the result of major industrial strategy intervention into renewable energy, which is creating high-quality jobs for a big manufacturer, but it's France. Why can't
we do that? Why can't we do that?
They absolutely can. I mean, we really can. This is what drives me up the wall. We are about to go through a process where the planning regulations for every new turbine in Scotland, they're all coming to the end of their life. The first generation of turbines are currently being replaced from 2 megawatts with 6 megawatts. The technology has moved forwards. If I've got 10 seconds to tell you a story, there is a farmer in Scotland who was offered £100,000 to put turbines on his land. 10 years later, the same company came back and said, we want to up the grading of the turbines. In the interceding 10 years, the man went away and did his arithmetic. And he discovered that he was getting ripped off. When the company came back, he said, no, that's fine. Your lease is up. Take your wind turbines down and go away. Short version of this, that man now makes £30 million a year from the same land because he was much less gullible the second time that he was negotiating with the big developer. Unfortunately, that farmer in one farm in one part of Scotland has learned the lesson of what big renewable companies will do if you don't press them better than the Scottish Government. He has negotiated better with a renewable energy deployment company than the Scottish Government. Full stop, end of story. We are the worst in Europe at capturing manufacturing from our energy base. There's no question about this, and I cannot understand why we're still making this mistake.
All right, well, we'll move on to John Mason. Perhaps he can enlighten us.
Thanks very much, Convener. Well, I do note that after World War I, we only had 4% forestry, so we have improved somewhat, but I accept there's room to go. On the question of procurement, which Richard Lyle somewhat stole my thunder, but it's difficult. I mean, I've got a problem because I do want us to use Scottish companies, but we're trying to be at the high end of the market and produce good quality, high quality products and get a better price for them. So if we buy Scottish things, it's almost inevitably going to be more expensive, is it not, than if we import them. So, for example, we're only going to get 3 hospitals instead of 4 if we insist on using Scottish labour, Scottish products, all the rest of it. If a council is wanting to buy butter for the kids, they can only buy £1. If it's Scottish butter, they can buy a kilo if it's foreign. So how do we square that circle between high-cost Scottish products for procurement and cheaper imports? Robin, if you can, yes.
Well, I mean, one of the great myths about this is that what we then do is we spend a whole bunch of money on the fact that there's no businesses based in our economy and we're dealing with poverty. So it's one of those circular things. On the case of the hospitals, I'm just going to say, well, we're currently paying for 2 and getting 1 on the basis of using crazy finance models. So if it's all about saving money, why are we still effectively PFI? The answer to this question is, why shouldn't our children in our schools be eating good butter for the extra 10% it costs? Would you rather have a wind turbine that's 10% more expensive and creates 500% more value in Scotland? If we wish to have a bargain basement procurement service, yes, we'll buy everything cheap from mass factories somewhere in Poland. And that's fine. That's a legitimate option. That's what we've been doing for the last 20 years, 15 years, more or less. But then don't hold an inquiry into why Scotland's economy is in a crisis. You've got to make choices. And I honestly think that people overstate how much financial benefit that you get from trimming a penny here or there from contracts. Because remember the other thing that we've done, we've bundled these contracts so big, so massive, that only a small number of big players can actually get the contract. So I would really like to see and really like to test whether we're actually getting as much benefit from these mega contracts as we think we are. If you procure 5 hospitals in one go, there is a much smaller number of contractors that you can go to. You limit the market, you limit the capacity to really test that market, and you are in the hands of the same probably half dozen potential suppliers. Whereas if you were to stop and you were to see, actually in Scotland there are good medium-sized large builders who would be perfectly capable of building one local school, but they're not capable of building 5 schools right across the region at the same time. Just think about the knock-on benefit of all of these things. And if you have any doubt at all, this argument was really put to bed if you go and look at what happened in Preston. I cannot commend enough the work of the Centre for Local Economic Strategy, and in particular the case study, the so-called Preston model. They did this. They stopped handing all the procurement money out to overseas businesses. They started keeping their procurement money in the local economy, and it was the only part of the north of England which saw economic growth over that period. This was driven by a small group of visionary councillors in one local authority area. It is now being studied by governments around the world. It's an established concept now. There is lots of information and data about this. So make a choice. Continue to try and save pennies halfpennies in the belief that it is the only option, or decide that you want to rebuild a productive manufacturing industry, food-producing industry in Scotland. Life's about choices, and I just think we're making the wrong one.
Okay, thanks for that. Could I go on to the other two then and ask, I mean, if I don't know if you agree with that theory that we should pay more. I mean, I'm quite attracted to that myself, but that would presumably mean higher taxes if we're going to pay extra for schools, for hospitals, for butter, for all of these things. Would that be the route that the other two, Peter, and would want to go down?
Peter Kelly.
I think it's a false choice, John. It's not really a choice. You know, as Robin has said, we need to make choices, but really that's not the choice between almost disinvesting in our local economy in the hope of saving and building more, or procuring more butter or whatever it might be, is not a realistic choice, and it's not a choice if we're to marry up all these ambitions that we have around a well-being economy and so on. Then that's not how we're going to get there. That's clearly not how we're going to get there. But I think fundamentally it's not proven. So I remember when the national minimum wage was being introduced, 20 odd years ago now. The predictions of the devastation it would cause for the economy because prices would go up. Of course it didn't happen. Of course it meant that people had, often the lowest paid workers who got an immediate boost to their income, spent that money locally. I think we need to think differently about how our economy works and what the purpose of our economy is, and whether that's looking to Preston or North Ayrshire for different models and different ways of running our economy. That's what we need to do, not constantly going back to a mantra that frankly we've had for now 30, 40 and a bit more years, that says we need to focus on the lowest cost. That's the most important thing. It's not, and it will just further embed the problems in our economy that have led us to our weaknesses that we have at the moment.
Thank you. Jack?
Thank you. Yeah, I was just building on what Peter and Robin had said, but also to say obviously cost is important. It is important to give value to the customer, being the Scottish public. But over the years, we've moved from just looking at cost to looking at cost and quality. But now we should be looking at cost, quality, and well-being when we're looking at our procurement services. I love French butter, but if we are to, if that is the cheaper option, we might be paying for it in the long run by disadvantaging a Scottish business that produces butter, and the income that you can generate within a community by giving better jobs, better paid jobs via these procurement services will benefit in the long run and hopefully move people out of poverty. You look at a study recently called the Living Wage Dividend, They've looked at modelling increasing wages across about 8 cities in the UK, one of which being Glasgow. If you increase the wages by of 25% of the low-paid population, the extra income spent in the local economy, but also gained in taxes, it is big enough to warrant thinking about procurement in a different way and not just purely concerned with cost and quality.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have a final question now from Rhoda Grant. Rhoda.
Thank you. Just a bit of a change, I guess. During the pandemic, we have seen the best and also possibly the worst of employment practice. How can we promote fair work policies and also protect industry against the economic crisis that's coming? Can we do both?
Peter Kelly.
I think we absolutely have to do both. If we don't, at this most crucial moment, promote fair work and ensure that we're trying to lay the basis as we come out of this crisis with better jobs, with more secure jobs, then we will fail in our response to COVID. How we do that is we build on some of the stuff that's already happening. This isn't about coming up with a new unheard of plan. There is a lot that we're doing in Scotland to promote fair work. So some of the stuff that's in the Fair Work Action Plan that the government has said that they will do more on. I think we need to see some clearer, more firm plans about how that will be taken forward. But I think the idea that employers also don't want to be associated with fair work and want to do the best by their employees, that's not what we've found. So again, Living Wage Week this week, we've accredited more than 180 employers during the pandemic. So it's not the idea that employers will simply remove themselves from discussions about decent work and fair work. So I think there's a responsibility on Scottish Government, on the employer federations and so on, to continue to push the boundaries on fair work, even in the midst of this crisis and as we come out of it.
Jack Evans.
First, I think we should be optimistic that we can shape a response to this crisis, but at the same time, I recognise the scale of the challenge and then the scale of the investment needed to meet that challenge. In terms of employment, I think it's important that we have targeted interventions in the areas that we know are going to be suffering, and for the groups that are going to be suffering most. JRF have a risk index of jobs that are most likely to be impacted pre-vaccine from the COVID. We know that 42% of those earning £8.33 and below are at high or very high risk of losing their jobs. So that could mean that there's a high concentration in the under 25 population, and also women are more likely to be than men to have a high risk of losing their jobs. And I think that we need to target our efforts in the sectors that we already know that they are in, and also in the local areas that we know that are being most affected by things like lack of vacancies. Lack of vacancies is an area that Scottish Government can help with, because we know that people are going to be out of work at some point, so getting people back into the labour market is vital, and and deciding what we do with those people that are out of the labour market is also important. Can't leave these people behind, and we need to ensure that our employment support services meet the demand. I think one specific example would be around parental employment support, that needs to make sure that we're focusing on lone parents as well.
Now, I think we'll actually have a last question, as it were, from Richard Lyle. So I'll allow Robin McAlpine to come back in response to this and perhaps sweep up if he wants anything from the previous question briefly. So, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, convener. This pandemic has changed our ways of working. As we see today, we're all in virtual remote working, digital economy. basically a lot of goods being delivered to people's doorsteps. Can this be used to the Scottish economy's advantage?
Robin McAlpine?
Do either Jack, Peter or Robin?
Yes, there's not time to talk about this here, but one of the things which we would really like to see explored is a Scottish distribution method. So if you look at one of the problems now, supermarkets have vertically integrated distribution. So they use distribution services are now part of their own business. What it means is that if you talk to small Scottish producers, they find it very difficult to reach market. They just can't get to market. They can't, the supermarkets are often their only route into, or high street retailers are often their only route to get to market. And they're very aggressive in their pricing, the supermarkets and the retailers, which means that they really squeeze these producers. One of the things I think we've got an enormous opportunity with new digital technology is to look at a Scottish distribution hub. So frankly, a large Scottish producer, Amazon, public or cooperatively produced and really promoted to say, look, if you want to buy from Scottish producers, here is a platform that lets you go straight to Scottish high quality producers. So there are technological solutions to ways to overcome problems that we've had in the past of getting producers in contact with consumers. And if you talk to businesses in Scotland, productive businesses, one of the top three things that they will tell you is a problem is market access. So yes, there's some real opportunities that we can explore there if we're being imaginative. I just want to answer one thing to Rhoda's previous question, which is to say I am absolutely in awe of virtually every small local business that I've seen during this pandemic. They have been amazing. My local pub has been an exemplary practice in how it's treated its workers. Every single one of them was guaranteed to come back on their full terms as soon as they could, and they put through the furlough and they did absolutely everything. Our local fruit shop has expanded to become virtually a public service for people locally in the town to make sure they had access to food. Our butchers, our local businesses, everybody has done the right thing. And I'm going to make this is just a strong philosophical belief that I have. There is an enormous benefit in any form of business model where the manager that makes the decisions can see the people who those decisions affect. It's the German Mittelstand effect. These are medium-sized, substantial businesses, but the managers are based in the plants, are based where the work is being done. And there's this thing which I think is fundamental, which is humans do not want to screw over other humans fundamentally. When you're working with people, if you're their boss, if you're their manager, if you're in the room with them, you're going to try and do the right thing. And that has been my overwhelming experience of small business in Scotland. The vast majority of them want to do, small and medium-sized business, the vast majority of them want to do the right thing. It is not that there are not good, big employers, but the second the person who is making the decisions about who to cut and who to drop and whose wages to squeeze is sitting in an office in a city many miles away from the people that these affect, it's just easier for them to make what we'll call the more brutal decisions. So if you want a well-being economy, encourage a larger number of smaller and medium-sized businesses and have less monopoly with big global corporations, because these are the businesses that genuinely do the right things. And I'm going to say it again, yes, the supermarkets kept us going through this pandemic as well, but where I am, some of our local businesses are virtually like a public service throughout this, and my hat's off to them. I've been round to them individually to thank them, and it's been an amazing contribution they've made. If we have more of our economy that is run by Scottish local people trying to do that kind of thing, we will, in and of itself, end up with a fairer and better economy. And this is my hope for Scotland, is that we can go back to being a country with a much more diverse business base, with many, many more businesses and a hell of a lot less being flown in by big online.
Thank you. That's fine. You've said your point. Peter Kelly.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I think it's not only just to pick up on the last point there, it's different forms of businesses as well. So I think we need to be thinking about how we support the continued growth of social enterprises, cooperatives and so on. It's not just support for small businesses. But I think to go to the last question, it has changed some of our ways of working. Some of us are working at home, many of us are not. Many people are doing those jobs that Robin's just talked about in terms of delivery. terms of care work that has not stopped and so on. But I think if this is an opportunity to change things, then it's thinking about what are we changing and for whom. So I think if we think about the new focus that's fallen upon essential workers that we've been relying on, I think that's our opportunity to turn that to our advantage, to say that we need to invest, make a real investment in those kind of jobs. So not just around the living wage, but also in conditions, also in terms of voice and representation, the workplace and so on. So I think there is an opportunity, say, to look at many jobs that have been undervalued in our economy for too long, and say, how do we value these jobs in the future? How do we actually invest in them? Childcare, the whole caring economy. That's where we need to be putting more of our investment. So that's the opportunity, I think, to turn this to our advantage.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our panel members. We will now move on to item 3 on the agenda. Item 3 on the agenda is the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. The committee has been asked to consider a notification from the Scottish Government relating to the Prohibition on Quantitative Restrictions EU Exit Regulations 2020. The committee will note that it considered an earlier draft in June, and as with the previous statutory instrument, this has been given a Category A classification. Further details are outlined in the committee's papers. The committee is invited to consider the notification and to decide whether it is content for these issues to be dealt with by statutory instrument laid at Westminster. If any member is not content for these matters to be so dealt with, please request to speak at this stage. No request to speak. We will take it from that the committee is content, and I will write to the Minister to notify him of the committee's position. At this stage, I will suspend the meeting and move into private session.